Okay, so this is a video where I'm going to try to dump as much information from my brain that I've been thinking about as I can because I have the time right now to make a video, and I'm going to talk about the Tower of Babel. Now, in one of my previous videos, I had some guy trolling me about something I said, basically because I was presenting the story of Eve being cursed from the standpoint of there being a real Adam and Eve who were the originators of all humankind. Now, if you think that that is a weird way to read the Bible, then you've probably tried studying the Bible through some higher education program, because for about 2,000 years, well, longer really, for Genesis, when people read the book of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve, it really seems to imply that in this book, which I'm referring to it as a book and saying, if you're reading it as a book, within the context of the book, Adam and Eve are the originators of all the human race. Now, you can question the validity of the book, but that's the way that the book is written, and that's the way that most people understand the book. Now, maybe this person doesn't know how to read a book, but when you read a book, you start at the beginning, you read all the way to the end. Then, if you're not sure about what something really meant, you can go back and reread and dig in and examine it more closely. And obviously, there's things like commentaries that people have made about the Bible. And yes, the Bible is a series of books. But even so, if you want to read the book of Genesis, you got to start at Genesis 1 and read all the way through chapter 50, and then go back and start digging it apart and dissecting it. So anyway, this is the way that I am reading the Bible, as if it was a book that has internal logical consistency and is not obscure and so difficult to understand. So that's my way that I'm approaching this from a literary standpoint, you could say. So the Tower of Babel story. Now, it's interesting because many cultures have a Babel-type story in their mythology, and the how of it varies widely. And some people may have had a better or worse understanding of what actually happened in their past. But the point is they have in common either this idea of languages changing and being scattered, or people being scattered and language being confused with other groups, or as a result of the scattering, the languages then became too distant, or because the languages were scattered, the people scattered as well. So either way, there is both a geographic and a linguistic dispersion. And as the whole amount of people was divided, so I believe was the language. In other words, what I'm saying is that you have 100 people, and then you divide them into 100 different places. Well, then you have, each person has 1% of the population. Also, the language was divided. So it's not to say, it's not like God took a decoder ring and took the one language and said, okay, we're going to twist this, and now all of the A's turn into B's, and all the B's turn into C's, and all the C's turn into D's, and so, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that's not true, because the languages are very different. They don't work that way. Now, some language develops over time, and it does change as people live in isolation. But it only tends to gain like new complex features as people groups encounter new problems or new people. And I shouldn't even say complexity, because that's a word that requires definition. But in some ways, ancient languages are much more complex than more modern ones. So Stone Age type cultures have very small vocabularies because they encounter neither new problems nor new people. So the amount of words that you have is small. You know, you're not going to have a word for helicopter if you've never seen a helicopter. You're not going to have a word for um, a whale if you live in the desert, if you've never seen a whale, you know, or something like that. So, so the more limited need you have for vocabulary, the less vocabulary you would have. So because of that, ancient languages have much smaller vocabularies than like English does. English has a massive vocabulary because if a word is in another language and we don't have a word for it, we just add that word to our language. So the total amount of English, words in English usage is massive, even though they don't all necessarily come from English. So the most rapid advancement of language development comes from people groups meeting and integrating their linguistic tools and concepts. And I think I'm going to just make a playlist of videos that I've watched rather than adding all the clips within here. But, there's a lot of evidence, like when we look at the language development around the Mediterranean area, the different cultures kind of developed certain tools that were more beneficial for them, and then when they came into a contact with another group, they would just take that group's special tools and add it to theirs, and they would adapt it to fit theirs. So hieroglyphics are the first type of writing, because when you cannot communicate well with someone and they don't understand a word, you can draw a picture. And if things are at hand, you may be able to point to them, but the advantage of drawing the picture or a series of pictures is that you can transport it or keep it for later, which are useful tools, or you don't have to worry about the message changing from person to person to person, because you have one original message that you can share. So pictographs are like simplified hieroglyphics, quicker to write, less to memorize. So they become, rather than a drawing of a cat, you make a cat symbol, and then it's easier to do. The symbol for a cat, and you can show that. Alphabets are what evolves when you have symbols that, instead of representing words, they represent sounds. And some alphabets are even better than the English alphabet that we use now, from what I understand. Apparently there's like in Korean, they use pictographs a lot, but the alphabet that they developed was more efficient than ours. I don't know what the status of that being used is, but so people have always borrowed from their neighbors to enhance their own understanding. And different people groups make different use of all the strengths and weaknesses of their own languages. Now, and this is where it gets into this thing of where I'm taking this story kind of seriously, because, the Tower of Babel, it's not just about this, God split up languages. Like, there's a reason why. And he was not pleased with what the people are doing. He had given them a command to go out, to fill the earth, to multiply, fill the earth, spread out, put people all over the place. He did not want them all clumping together. And that's what they chose to do, exactly that. And they were trying to build a tower and a city to keep themselves from being scattered. That was the thing they were trying to avoid. Now, this story is often brought in, to the technological aspect of it. As it says in verse 6, the Lord said, "If as one people, all sharing a common language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. Come, let's go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other." So we can grasp the concept of, oh yes, well, a people group speaking one language will communicate much better than nobody speaking the same language. But I think that beyond that, when we look at the whole realm of languages, they are as I said, it's not like they're parallels of each other. They're actually very, very different. And different languages have very different strengths and weaknesses. And so I think if you think about, like, you have this whole group of people and it's divided. And like in Genesis 10, it gives us this table of nations, like 70 groups. And from what I understand, some people said that we can trace the language that we have now back to maybe 70 or 80 or so possible roots. So from 70 or 80 original languages, they could develop into the various languages that we have today. They turn into different dialects, and then over time those dialects become more nuanced, more particular, and they are full-fledged languages that are different from other dialects that came from the same source. So, but like I was saying, so if we have a whole group of people and the people are divided, so it's not, you don't have 70 people and then 70 groups of 70 people. You'd have 70 people and then you have 70 groups of one people, or the 70 groups probably more than one person, but 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, we don't know. But the large group is divided into many smaller groups. And I think that in the same way, we can think of, if there was an original language that had all of the various strengths of all the other languages and none of the weaknesses, which makes sense because if this is the language that God first used to communicate, then each of these groups may have gotten a limited portion of a vocabulary and a limited portion of grammar and language rules and things like that. And then what they would have had was an ability to communicate certain things extremely well and an ability to communicate almost everything else that was very poor. And so that is what I'm saying, that the language itself was divided because the technological aspect of it is not simply, the unity, because we have people in every nation who speak the same language, but they don't necessarily always communicate that well. I mean, you could look at any nation in the world, and you might have people who basically speak one common language, but they're still very divided over other things. Because our language is not perfect. It's not the best at communicating things. But within each language, there are certain things that can be communicated extremely well. And so, to me, that seems like a hint as to what an original language might have been like. Okay. So, people have always borrowed from their neighbors to enhance their own understandings, and different people groups make different uses of the strengths and weaknesses of their own languages. Now, there's been for a long time a disdain for the hypothesis that language influences thought. There are a few bold academicians who are bucking that trend and are showing that it certainly does have some degree of truth to it. This is the Saphir-Worth hypothesis that if you learn a certain native language, that native language shapes the way that you think, and it shapes your whole outlook on life. Which, makes sense if you think about all these people intentionally being scattered to have different languages, that there would be differences of those languages and it would affect things. Now, there are people that have done study and they're showing that there are many differences in regards to things like time, space, perception of and direction, counting, and color. So, like in English or in our culture, we are usually thinking about like a base 10 counting system because we have 5 fingers on each hand. And when we give someone directions, we tend to, from our viewpoint, describe things as being right and left, forward and backward, and there are other cultures that do that in a totally different way. There are some cultures where that people always think in regards of north and south and east and west, and if you turn, they know now I'm facing west, and so then they'll give you the directions, in a different way. So, and likewise, there's different methods of counting. Some languages only have like words for few and many. There was an interesting video that was on the meaning code not too long ago about the number 0 and how it wasn't part of certain languages, but then it was added from some other ones, and that was a big advancement, and it had a huge impact. So even something like that, does your language have 0 or not? That makes a big difference. And that does change the way people think, because without 0, you never think about certain things in the same way, and then the thoughts just never arise. But as soon as you hear about this concept of 0, then you can think in a different way. And it's the same thing with colors too. Like some languages only have words for light and dark, and they can't distinguish between other things. Certain people don't have like a word for blue. But then when they learn about blue, then they can start to discern that there is a blueness to things, and they see it in a different way. So the connection between thought and language is there. It's not absolute, because we still can communicate with each other, and we can communicate with people who have different languages, but our native language tends to be the way that we do a good amount of our thinking. Not everything. Some people have more visual thoughts than verbal thoughts, but if you have verbal thoughts, your thoughts are in your native language, and so there's a difference there. Okay, so, and how languages communicate things also varies widely. So different languages express certain concepts extremely well, and translating those concepts into another language requires more and more degrees of effort and complexity. A word in one language may need a sentence in another, or a paragraph, or an essay. However, it is only in some concepts that this is the case. So, some examples of this is, there's like these German words that we use sometimes, like zeitgeist, and somebody used a couple other ones in my on a comment on a video, but certain like emotional things, and like we use the German word because it's easier to use that one word that carries a whole bunch of meaning rather than saying a sentence in English every time. And people say, this basically means this, but it's not exactly quite right, and you'll hear that sort of thing. I remember hearing a criticism about French as an international language is not the best because it has a hard time with certain numbers and counting certain things. So mathematical concepts are not best done in French. But French has other strengths. There was another one about Shakespeare. He wrote in iambic pentameter, which works in English and doesn't work in French. So if you translate Shakespeare from English into French, the way that you say it, the enunciation of the accent on the syllables is different, and it doesn't feel the same. So the story can be conveyed, but the nuance goes missing. And then other languages like Mandarin, it's very easy to express numbers and counting systems, which gives an advantage to native speakers of those languages in learning math, and then they're able to do it more efficiently. And there's all sorts of types of things like this all over the place. So that those are some of the interesting things about it. So we look at this Tower of Babel as a real historical event. There's a couple, we can use the story to infer a couple things. First, there's no actual evidence that refutes it other than the scholarly belief that only natural causes are possible. Therefore, as an explanatory tool, I believe it gives a far better explanation to things like linguistic similarity and comparative mythology, and even a better explanation for the notions that different cultures were always borrowing and stealing myths and stories from one another. So, like, for instance, you'll have this documentary hypothesis idea of Genesis and say that, oh, there was these 4 different sources and they were borrowing it from this, and they were just like combining it, and people don't do that in a good way. It doesn't work well. But there's reasons why we say that, or people will say that there's certain polemical language in the Bible that points to its cultural context, and they say like, oh, the Hebrews were writing this in response to the things that were going on in Babylon, and then everybody wants to get on a time scale and say, what's the oldest? And we'll say, like, Egyptian is oldest, and then, like, the first Babylonian civilization and the Sumerians and the Hittites, and we want to go from oldest to newest, and then we just say, like, everybody copied that story from them, and then they just put their own spin on it, and that's how these things developed. And we always want to do it in, like, this Darwinian way, that's how all things happen. But if you think about it, imagine for a moment a city, a unified people, all working together for the common goal of building this tower and building this city. And if you want to build a city efficiently, you're going to train your people as specialists. That's the way that we do everything now. If you are a farmer living on your own, you need to be a generalist. You need to do everything. You need to learn how to take care of the land, how to take care of your building, how to take care of your animals, how to take care of your family. You need to learn about finance. You need to learn about bartering. Maybe your wife learns how to take care of the clothing and the weaving. You have to skin the animals to provide the leather. All this crazy amount of stuff. You got to make your tools. You got to do everything. Well, once you get cities and you have people living in community, you get specialization. You have a blacksmith who works all the time making iron, and that's all he does, and everybody else just brings him their goods for barter, or they use money or whatever. And so everything becomes specialized. Now, people may have some general knowledge of this and that, but as cities become more complex, individuals become more specialized. Now you have a situation today where most people, if they were stranded on a desert island, they would just die immediately because they have no skills whatsoever. So if you thought about, like, what if the Tower of Babel happened in your town, and nobody could speak to each other? Some people would be doing okay in some regards, and some people would find themselves with a bunch of totally irrelevant and useless skills in contributing to a new reality. So if you imagine that this city here gets struck by God in this miraculous way, and everybody splits up and everybody runs out in different ways, and as the verse in Deuteronomy 32 puts it, according to the sons of God, that God didn't just scatter their languages, but he had agents, angelic beings, who maybe looked just like men, but were leading the people or driving them into these other places. Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided up mankind, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the heavenly assembly. So, every group of people had somebody leading them, so just imagine this confusion, and everybody's talking languages you don't understand, and then you hear one voice saying, come this way, I know where we're going, and you follow that person. Well, in all of those different groups, there's going to be a wide variety of skills that they have and skills that they do not have. So maybe they all have a little bit of general idea about foraging or farming or something, But, one guy was making the bricks. One guy was making the tools to form the bricks. Another guy was, doing the woodwork. And somebody was good at the weaving. And maybe these skills, were not distributed equally in all groups. Almost certainly they weren't. And so, part of that as well would be the wisdom and the tradition and the knowledge. Now, this is an oral culture, and in an oral tradition, there are people who that is their job. The wise man, the priest, the shaman, he's the keeper of the story. So he's got to know and remember all those things. And there may not necessarily have been somebody who fulfilled that role in every one of these groups. But obviously, those who remember stories share them with the whole community. So everybody's going to have some idea, some familiarity with what was going on. And what they didn't have, they would have to fill in the gaps. Now, if they're just super isolated, they're just going to have to make it up, or they're going to have to use the little bit of knowledge that they have and infer everything else from it. And like as an example of that, so here's an Aztec belief. The Aztec story maintains that only a man, Cox, and a woman, Xochiquetzal, survive a large flood, having floated on a piece of bark. They found themselves on land and begot many children who were at first born unable to speak, but subsequently, upon the arrival of a dove, were endowed with language, although each one was given a different speech such that they could not understand one another. So this has like a flood element. So you kind of have like a Noah character, but it's also kind of Adam and Eve as Noah surviving a flood. And then, there's this thing with the dove, which is part of the flood story, and that comes in. And, so this is like the people didn't remember the story the whole way, and they kind of pieced it together and added their own bits. Or in Greek mythology, there is one that told that for ages men had lived without law under the rule of Zeus, and speaking one language gifted to them by the god and goddess of ingenuity, Philarios and Philarion. The god Hermes brought diversity in speech, and along with it, separation into nations, and discord ensued. So that very much has the divine element. It's more specific just to that Babel story. And then here's like one from Australia. In remote times, an old woman named Wururi lived towards the east and generally walked with a large stick in her hand to scatter the fires around which others were sleeping. Wururi at length died. Greatly delighted at this circumstance, they sent messengers in all directions to give notice of her death. Men, women, and children came, not to lament, but to show their joy. The Ramanjirar were the first who fell upon the corpse and began eating the flesh, and immediately began to speak intelligibly. The other tribes to the eastward, arriving later, ate the contents of the intestines, which caused them to speak a language slightly different. The northern tribes came last and devoured the intestines and all that remained, and immediately spoke a language differing still more from that of the Ramanjirar. So that's like got more of this like death of the gods and the sacrifice and eating the flesh thing, which comes from other parts of the mythological story, but the result is this difference of language thing. So it makes sense that these different groups would have different little bits and things. And so then if you think about it, as these groups are slightly less separate, as they begin to come into contact with each other and learn to communicate in certain ways, they're all trying to figure out the story. They all know that there's parts of their background and their mythology that they do not have, that they're missing. So of course they would be borrowing from one another and trying to fill in the gaps. And if they're missing a part of their story and they get a part from somebody else and it's not quite right, well, they don't now have anything else to base it on, so they're just going to add it into their tradition. And so, so then there is a sort of thing of like who got there first. That does kind of have a primacy to it. But, that's why it seems sort of like it works that way, but I think that it's actually a better explanation if you think about all the people being scattered at one time, having a common body of knowledge, but individuals weren't all perfect at maintaining that knowledge, and then they get scattered. Well, once people start coming into contact with each other, they're going to start to share things. They're going to share their linguistic tools, and they're going to share their stories, because they all were missing out, and they all had partial things. So it's not necessarily. It doesn't make sense that it's this organic thing of just like everybody coming up with stuff out of the blue, which for some reason is all super similar but a little bit different, and then it, kind of conglomerates and becomes this more universal story. I think they all knew that there was one unifying story of mankind, and that they had all kept and lost different bits of it. So Genesis 11:1 says that they had a common language and speech. Oh, okay. And so this is the first thing I want to say. Yeah, that this Tower of Babel story, I think, does explain linguistic similarity, because God didn't want the people to never be able to communicate with each other. So there was similarities, but there was enough difference. So like, when people say like, oh, everything came from the Indo-European language, I don't think that there was a Proto-Indo-European language. I think that there was enough general similarity amongst the nations that God put in one geographic area, large area, that they were able to communicate and share with each other over time. So I don't think that it necessarily, and so I guess in a sense you could say perhaps the Proto-Indo-European language was all part of the one original language, but and that's why we even have like linguists even define them as Semitic languages and Hamitic and Japhethic languages. Like, there was enough similarity so that as people separated, began to develop their cultures, and then came back into contact with each other, communication was possible. So that's the first kind of thing you can get from this story. I think it is a good way to look at the way the world works. Secondly, I think that we can look backward and infer what a divine universal language might have been like, and reason out why it was far too powerful of a psychic tool to leave in the hands of humans that were determined to do evil. So, psychic tools that's the kind of thing that John Vervaeke talks about, and like the alphabet was a psychic tool. When that was finally developed, that was a huge advancement. And other things, philosophical ideas can function in that way. I think that if we look at the way that ancient languages and roots of ancient languages are structured, it's super efficient at communicating one little thing, and then actually really bad at communicating a lot of other stuff, because people were probably taking what worked and trying to figure out a bunch of other stuff, and it didn't work that great. But if you had all the most efficient parts of all the different languages in the world, then you would be able to communicate so effectively, and the amount of confusion that would disappear from people understanding one another with like a universal perfect language would be amazing. And and not only would people have had more of they would be more used to using their memorization, because I don't believe that there was writing, that there was no need for writing, because your communication would be succinct and it would be efficient, and there wouldn't be a lot of back and forth, which would make it more memorable, which would mean that all the communication was just compressed. You would say a small amount of words and people would understand a lot of information from that, and they would be able to remember it because of that. Genesis 11:1 says that they had a common language and speech. Lip and word are the most literal or words, or as the Bible puts it, a common language and a common vocabulary. So the distinction between language and vocabulary is important. Language is the system of grammar and syntax. Vocabulary is the words. You can speak the same language and change all the words, a different vocabulary. And this is like a code word system. Like the context would allow a native speaker of the language to decipher some or all of the meaning. As an example, oftentimes like things like instruction manuals may be poorly translated because the vocabulary is switched, but the language itself is not. To truly translate something well, a person must understand both languages, decipher the meaning of the words in one, and write them down in the other with the same meaning. So, surprise, language is about meaning. It's not just about the words. Two people who have the same or similar language but different vocabulary can communicate far easier, such as speakers of Spanish and Italian or Portuguese. They all have a basic, the language is almost the same, but they have a different vocabulary. The words are different. But once you learn what the analog is, you switch this word for that, a person speaking Spanish can probably be understood by someone who speaks Italian and vice versa. Once language becomes written, though, you actually have more of the second problem, a similar vocabulary used by multiple languages. Hieroglyphs and pictographs are somewhat universal, so you can have a vocabulary. This symbol, cat symbol. But, when somebody reads it, they will all read that same word in various different ways because their language is different. And as pictographs and things become more symbolic, they represent increasingly different and nuanced things to different people. An example of this is that when cuneiform was finally deciphered, some of the difficulty that they had in understanding the cuneiform that they would find was because in several places the same phrases were written in 2 or 3 languages using the same cuneiform symbols. So, and that would be an equivalent of like, I had an example here, if I take one sentence in English and I translate it into German and French and something else, Swedish or Dutch, those languages all use the same letters in their written languages, the same 26 letters more or less make up the alphabet, but the words themselves are very different. So if you just saw a bunch of characters that were all part of the same alphabet and you didn't know that it was 4 different languages, you would have a really hard time figuring it out from nothing, which is what they basically did with cuneiforms. They kind of figured it out from nothing. So all 3 of those examples, or those things, use the same, they use the same alphabet, but they have different words. So, that's a distinction there, but why there's those 2 things, I think. The language and the vocabulary. They all had the same system of language, and they all had the same body of words from which to share. So that's a very efficient communication system. Now, there's a lot of interesting and ideas about language before the Tower of Babel, what it could have been like. One of these colloquial ideas that some, Christian fundamentalists like to hold on to is that Hebrew was the language. Hebrew almost certainly was not the language before the Tower of Babel, because Hebrew has a lot of the characteristics of many other languages that are, there's nothing that would make it uniquely universal if people had it. People just think that because that's the language that the Bible is written in that we're presented with. But I think that if you consider the way that language developed over time, and I will include a really good video that's kind of like a fun cartoon about kind of the development of the alphabet. The alphabetic language was developed in Hebrew Canaanite area, and it's probably the biggest psycho tool that came at that time. And so in that sense, it makes sense to me that God would wait until the revelation of the law to Moses until that time, when there was this development of language, which may have also have been like a kind of the first, on the tablets, it might have been this kind of like proto-Hebrew hieroglyphic pictograph thing. There's a really good website that has a lot of information on that, if I can find it. But there. So people, when they want to have this idea about like what got borrowed from where, and they want to say like, oh, all of the ideas were borrowed from this culture because their language developed first. It's not necessarily true. It's just that's what's recorded first. The Bible tells us that the Hebrew people were a nomadic people. They were living in Egypt, and I think bringing them to Egypt was part of their development of culture. They were able to take all of the useful parts of Egyptian culture, which included hieroglyphic writing of some sort, and most likely, like Moses did learn Akkadian because the Egyptians were fluent in multiple languages, and so you take these different languages and these things and you combine them and you make use of them, and I think that that is part of their development. But at some point you do have to take a spiritual decision to say, is strict chronology the overarching authoritative method of when ideas were first developed, or is it simply a chronology of when things were first recorded? And so in that sense, other cultures recorded their mythologies in inefficient, less efficient forms of writing, so they got there first and they got that little advantage. But what ideas have stood the test of time? In those days they thought that you have your mythology and your god, and I have my mythology and my god, and the way that we'll figure out who's right is we're gonna have a war. Well, we don't do that anymore, really. So I guess some of the Islamists are still trying to do that, but in those outcomes, the Hebrew God won. There's no more Canaanite tribes trying to put forth Baal as the supreme deity. And even if we look further on beyond the Tower of Babel, with this whole idea of like borrowing and stuff, so there was different times when Scripture was revealed, and progressed over time. But what was revealed by God, or what Moses, codified, if you look at like the Book of Jubilees, it kind of has like Genesis in it, but it says like Moses went up to Mount Sinai and the angels came and they told him this is what happened in Genesis. So, and that may be true that they gave him the authoritative version of events, with all the corrections, but the Israelites just came out of Egypt, so they had all the Egyptian ideas, and then they had whatever ideas and stories Abraham brought from before then, and they may have been very well preserved. So, there's no reason to assume that like nobody had any idea of any of the stuff that happened in Genesis until Moses came down from the mountain and shared it with them. If anything, what Moses brought down was just the affirmation of what they did know that was correct, the confirmation of the correct parts, correction of some of their wrong misconceptions. And, it's interesting because some of the places where you see like the errors, it's like the same ones. Like there's in the Universal History video, Richard Rowland brings up this legend that some of the like Norse people thought they were descended from a fourth son of Noah, that Noah had a son born on the ark, and that's who their ancestor was. Well, if you look at the Bible in Genesis 9, there is a very strong indication that there's a polemical, writing trying to refute the idea that maybe Canaan was the son of Noah. Because it says, like, a whole bunch of times, it makes it clear that he's not, which it doesn't make any sense unless if somebody thought that he was. So, as it says here, the sons of Noah, this is Genesis 9:18, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the sons of Noah. From them the whole earth was populated. So he tells you these are the three sons that came out of the ark, but they mention Canaan as well, and saying Ham was Canaan's father. And then it talks about when Ham goes into the tent and sees his father's nakedness, which, there's, to me, the best explanation is that this is euphemism of Ham slept with Noah's wife, who I don't necessarily think, I think probably was not Ham's mother. It probably was another second wife. And that is why when Noah awakens from his drunken stupor and finds out what his youngest son had done to him, he curses Canaan. He doesn't curse Ham, the one that did it. He curses Ham's son. Why? Because he probably figured out this kid that I thought was my kid is actually a bastard, and it's my son's kid. So I'm fairly confident that the Canaanites were probably, in their mythology, saying Canaan was the son of Noah, and putting him on this equal step. Well, no, he's not. He's a grandson of Noah, and he's a bastard. So, that there is that kind of stuff. The discrepancies. What are you going to do if there's discrepancies between two mythologies? Well, they both probably can't both be right if they're direct discrepancies. If they're describing different things in similar ways, then maybe they both could happen. But so anyway, those types of things are in the Bible. So, and so, there was a text that Moses brought down, which was probably a Hebrew hieroglyph kind of a thing. And then around the time of Samuel, it was translated into this Neothic text. Samuel's prophets in the school, Neoth in Ramah, where the Torah is translated from hieroglyphic Hebrew into Paleo-Hebrew. And Paleo-Hebrew is actually what you see if you look at the Samaritan Pentateuch. So it's kind of like this more ancient caveman-looking Hebrew letters. The Hebrew that we see today, when people get like bad tattoos and stuff, that is like Babylonian block Hebrew letters, which that was produced during the time of Ezra, the Quattordecim text, which was probably the basis for the Septuagint, and then the Masoretic text, which, we have the oldest one from like the Middle Ages, but that was probably, there was probably a Hebrew base behind it. So, there's all this interesting stuff. And, people, will say like, wow, there's differences. It's not the same, blah, 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 blah. But I think that, if you think about it, this thing of the Tower of Babel, that there's a continual process to try to make sense of things. And as the Hebrews came into contact with other cultures, they needed to update their body of knowledge to incorporate and speak to new things. And, there's even some stuff in there where, like, Ezra kind of had a beef with the Samaritans, so he actually did change some of the stuff in his version, where he changed the mountain that some of the sacrifices happened on to refute the Samaritan ideas. So, you can see within this particular text or that, there are these sort of like discrepancies. But does it change the meaning of the thing? No, it doesn't. And I think that if you look at it through the lens of this Tower of Babel story being true and likely and plausible, and if you don't want to believe that, then imagine that the multiverse is real, and I'm talking about the world in which the Bible actually happened, which maybe is this one, maybe it's a different one. But, if there's a multiverse and unlimited universes where all possible things are true, then imagine that I'm talking about the universe where what the Bible says actually happened, and then this will all make sense. So if that's the case, then, then this Tower of Babel story means that there will be a need to edit things, and it's not changing the meaning necessarily. It's the same thing we do today, where those people that are saying like the King James is the only correct translation, but King James English is nothing like modern English, so you need to update the language. You need to do that, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. It starts to mean things other than what it means, just because time and language have changed. So editorial updates and retranslating things is fine. It's a good concept. It makes sense, and it doesn't invalidate the Word of God. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, like, oh yeah, this stuff was all based off of the Babylonians and they were just like copying from other people and making it all up. No, I mean, I don't think so. I think that we can believe that it was divinely given to Moses to write down the first 5 books of the Bible, and then edited by like Joshua and re-edited by Samuel, and with the inclusion of judges. And anyway, so there's a middle ground between the kind of like the people that act as if the Bible was like delivered from a spaceship or something, like intact, and this like super critical viewpoint of like just dumb people making stuff up and it all getting together and it turns into the Bible, emerging from the collective unconsciousness. I think there's a logical way that we can look at how the Bible came to be, and why it has changes and things in it that are they're all in there, and they can tell us about the thing that it's describing. So going back to this Tower of Babel thing, there's some interesting things. So I may include the clip here from Rick Beato's video, and he's talking about the acquisition of language in infants.
Okay, so why can babies learn perfect pitch? Well, they don't actually learn it, they retain it. You see, every baby is born with the ability to hear the sounds of all languages spoken on Earth. There are 6,500 languages that are spoken on Earth. Out of those languages, there are 2,000 phonetic units, phonemes they're called. These phonetic units are the sounds that make up syllables. In the English, ba, ma, ta. Babies can hear the sounds of all the phonemes of all the languages spoken on Earth. So that's 2,000 phonemes out of the 6,500 languages. In English, we only use 44 phonemes. By the time a baby hits around 9 months of age, they begin to lose the ability to hear all of these sounds and can only hear the sounds of the language that are spoken in their household. If there are 5 languages spoken, they will be able to hear the sounds of all 5 of those languages. When a parent interacts with a baby, the baby begins taking statistical analysis on the sounds they are hearing. They're little sponges that soak up language. So they start breaking apart these phonetic units and they start to learn language. They don't know any of the rules, they're just listening to the sounds. They're looking for patterns of repetition and sequences in sound. This is how babies learn their native language. When you learn it as an adult, it's called a foreign language. Babies do the same thing with music. They take statistical analysis on the sounds they're hearing. When they're exposed to unpredictable, highly complex music, like Bach's C-sharp major prelude from the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, that has all these unexpected modulations, that's when the babies open up that gate and begin to take statistical analysis on the sounds. They need unexpected twists and turns. That's how babies learn. They learn by things. They don't learn by things that are predictable. They learn by things that are unpredictable. That's why modern jazz, with its unpredictable cadences, played by the greatest players in the world, like Keith Jarrett and John Coltrane and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, when babies hear that music, that's when they start taking notes on the notes. They begin to hear these 12 associated pitches that we use in Western music. Those notes start to gain in importance over the sounds that they're hearing in nature that are unpitched or that are out of tune with those pitched notes. So they begin to recognize them. Think of it as there are 12 pitch buckets. And as these pitch buckets start to get filled with these pitches, each of these pitches start to stand out from one another. The babies will then begin to recognize the notes by their pitch color. If you compare it to language, when a baby is engaged with their parents, they're not only hearing their parents speaking to them, they're hearing their parents speak to each other. And they're hearing them use thousands and thousands of combinations of words to create their conversations. Well, it's the same thing with music. Babies need to be exposed to highly complex music that has thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of combinations, different combinations of those 12 pitches in different chords and unusual combinations. If you play a baby songs that have the same 4 chords and they have the same simple synthesizer melodies or pop melodies, it's like learning a language with 4 words. They just can't do it. Babies, to learn their native language, need to hear hundreds of thousands of combinations of sentences, of phonemes, phonetic units, put together, strung together, in different orders. They learn through the unpredictability. My concept is to play babies really sophisticated music, what I call high information music. And if a baby hears enough of these, they don't learn by predictable sounds. They learn by unpredictable things. Babies always learn by unpredictable things. That's why you need to play jazz and things that have unexpected modulations, resolutions, things like that, or modern classical music, or Bach. Things that modulate a lot.
And every human baby, infant, has the ability to learn any language that is spoken on earth. And there's like 2,000 phonemes amongst all languages. These are the sounds of a language. And yet, every infant is born with the ability to learn all of those, despite the fact that they may have come from descendants who only knew a very small amount, like there's like 40-something phonemes in English. And yet, for some reason, that information keeps getting passed down genetically, even though it's unused all the time. So it does speak to the idea that, if there was one language, it would be much more powerful than any of the languages that we have now. And the interesting thing is that the way that a child learns a language is not, you don't have to teach babies like they're babies. You don't say like, you don't have to teach a baby phonics and like just teach it how to make sounds or anything like that. You do have to teach this when they're learning how to write and read, but when they're learning to speak, they actually take the whole complexity of all the language that they hear and they distill it into patterns in their brain and they make sense of it, and they incorporate other sense data in that to decipher the meaning of the words that they hear. And this starts, with while they're still in the womb. While they're still in the womb, they're hearing all this complex stuff, and they're hearing thousands and thousands of different words and phrases with inflection and tone of voice and even pitch, which is the thing that he was expressing in his video as a particular twist to it. And they take out of that complexity, their brain unconsciously or whatever, is making sense of all this thing and filtering everything into like these different buckets of meaning and making sense of it. And then this ability is lost by the time they're about 2 years old. So, it's something that is passed down to children, even though adults can't do it. It's a pretty crazy thing. But the interesting thing that he was saying is that he was talking about how if you wanted to learn perfect pitch, adults cannot learn perfect pitch because perfect pitch comes from the part of our brain that learns a native language, not a secondary language, but only a native language. And as a baby is learning a native language, as it's deciphering these patterns, it can even do that with pitches. And so what he was saying is that if your baby is listening to extremely complex music all the time, it will decipher out of the complexity the key notes, the 12 major notes, in Western music that are played, and it will assign to those things meanings or whatever. He explains how this is what happened with his son. He didn't intend to teach his son to have perfect pitch, but just because his son was exposed to complex music all the time, because that's what his dad deals with, and that's what they're listening to in their house, he developed perfect pitch naturally. So it's not random because it happens more often in languages that have pitch as an element, like Mandarin. And so, you could potentially, in a hypothetical world, if you wanted to, you could create a language that was all music. If you had musical phrases instead of words that meant certain things, it could be in a complex way, it would be a weird experiment, you couldn't just do it, but language could be communicated without words as such, or phrases could be, musical phrases, melodies could be a replacement for words, and our brains would be able to understand that as language, and people could communicate with each other through singing or through playing an instrument or whatever. And the same way is that, it's not like words don't necessarily inherently have meaning. They do have meaning because we have agreed upon it. The interesting thing Jordan Peterson spoke about recently with Joe Rogan is that basic understanding of meaning that we have for words really all comes out of the Bible. But imagine this would be a cruel thing to do for a child, but if you wanted to, if you were totally consistent and every time you were going to say love, you said hate, and every time you were going to say like, you said dislike or whatever, and you just took all of the words on the scale from like to hate, love to hate, and you reverse the order of them, in the degrees that you would, loathe, disdain, whatever. You just made like a spectrum of words and reversed it, and you taught your kid that, then they would hear those words and they would understand the same thing that they would hear hate and they would understand love because they would have deciphered that word from the context of everything. And the simple thing you could do is you could do this with a dog. Dogs, they do actually learn words, but they more or less go by tone of voice to a certain degree. So dogs will learn specific words, but if you say like, "You're such a stupid dog. You're such a dumb dog. I hate you," the dog will still wave his tail and be all happy because he's hearing you say those words in a way that is expressing praise and kindness, and you know. So in a similar way, the dog is not able to learn as much as the child, but that's how the child learns what the words mean, is from the context of all the different patterns that it hears in it and all the different things. And it's pretty amazing. Like, before having children, I didn't know how do you teach your kids to talk, but like, look, they just start talking one day. You can just talk to them. It's crazy. They can have pretty good conversations even when they're very little. So you could do that, and you could teach a child, and they would have a perfectly fine understanding of things, except when they went to interact with anybody else, then they would be very confused, because when they would hear the word love, it would seem like that was the absolute wrong word to use. Words, they don't necessarily have meaning. They do derive their meaning from their context. But we do sort of have a base context of words, which, as Jordan Peterson says, is kind of codified in the Bible. But even the fact that when we look at like these comparative mythologies from all around the world, they are also sort of sharing a context. And there is differences, and I kind of talked about a little bit why that is. But, we have, you have to think about this, like, if the pre-Babel language was like this perfect language that was the most efficient and the best at communicating, and then everybody's language is shattered in these different ways, if nobody in that particular group thought it was really important to try to remember these stories, or they didn't make up the vocabulary, then that information would be lost in the first generation. Like, let's say for instance a group gets off into some place and there's like trees, and so they kind of develop like a culture around harvesting lumber and things like that, and they don't have any like metalworking. Well, the first person that came from the Tower of Babel would probably have words in their mind for metalworking, and in whatever way their language was uniquely changed, they would have been able to describe it as metalworking. But if they died without anybody asking them about metalworking, then the next people are going to have to figure out how to make up a word for that. And I think the same thing goes with these stories too. So the stories, were probably passed down, and whatever vocabulary they had, was going to be different, and therefore the meaning was different, and understanding was different. And that's even why I think, when we look at like Genesis chapter 1, the only person that was present in Genesis chapter 1 was God. And I think that there is a very good likelihood that God shared the information of Genesis chapter 1 with Adam, and Adam had that information and passed it down to his children. And I think if we look at all those stories, you could see that there was some key critical elements that were important, that they wanted their children to know, and that they wanted to be memorialized and kept and passed on. But there's a whole lot of detail around it that if nobody asked the person who knew firsthand, where did those garments of skin come from? Why was, what was the Garden of Eden like? Can you give us some more description? If nobody asked these questions and it didn't get written down, then once the first guy was gone, the information was gone too. So, that's where, I think you kind of start to get all these little holes in these things. And everybody has a patchy recollection of what's happening, and they're going to try to work together to figure these things out, and people will take information from their neighbor that seems to fit, and if some of that's wrong, then they're gonna be basing a lot of things on wrong assumptions, and so I think that's why you have some of the stuff of like, it's a nice thought, like, oh, the first people had this context of the ancient Near East, and that's what they used to interpret Genesis chapter 1, and it meant this to them, and it didn't mean this other thing. And honestly, I think you can say that's true about interpretations of things, but it really does seem like, I think what they had was the words. I think they had the book. They had the information. I don't think they had the understanding. And that's why it's still a mystery now. Because if it made such perfect sense back then, they would have lived a little bit differently. But, the Bible story, they had this word of God and they didn't appreciate it and they didn't take care of it. And it really, until you get to the Second Temple period, the Hebrews were not good stewards of the scripture that they had, which they believed to be divine revelation. And in that sense, I don't even think that they developed any real confidence in the superiority of their tradition until the time of the return from the Babylonian exile. So, they had this stuff passed on, and then their neighbor came and said, well, Baal is the one that did all that stuff. He's the guy you got to worship. And they would be like, oh, okay, we'll worship Baal. He seems good. They just, it takes a long time for these ideas to develop. So that's part of the beef I have with the ancient Near East context. Not that it's not important. It is important. And I believe that we can learn interesting things about the Bible and helpful things, but their understanding wasn't perfect. And I think that, especially when we look at everything prior to that story of the Tower of Babel, it's hard to know, like everything is basically a translation. Even the Hebrew that God gave to Moses or whatever, or when they codified those stories into Hebrew, there's still some stuff that it's like, well, what does that mean exactly? The language had some limitations. And so this is something where you look at, like, there's a difference between like complexity and efficiency. And some of these ancient languages were really more complex than ours, but they weren't necessarily more efficient. Now, in some ways you say like, oh, like we have the 4 loves in Greek and they all have these different meanings and each one of those meanings carried a whole thing. Well, that it's good that they had 4 different words for that and that they could explain the different meanings because of it. But like, there are some understandings that, or either way, you could say, when you try and translate it into English, you have to use a lot more words because you're explaining this thing. So maybe some of those concepts were the efficient parts of Greek and what it was good at conveying. So it could pack a lot more into a small word. Now, some of these other things are more difficult, like Etruscan. They use the same alphabet as the Greek alphabet, but it's like a totally different language, and we still can't figure out how everything works. It seems like it's very complicated. So that kind of like goes against the whole like Darwinian idea that that the languages would go from simple to complex. They actually kind of go the other way. And I think that's because, I was thinking about this. I'm trying to think about, of an analogy that makes it easy to understand. Okay, so maybe something like this. Now, let's say I'm a carpenter and I like woodworking. Now, if you just had a chisel and a hammer, or you could do everything with a chisel and a hammer, because a chisel will remove wood. And what you need to do is you need to take pieces of wood and shape it to a particular shape. You want to build a table, you want to build chairs. You need to shape those pieces to be the correct length and size and everything that you need them to do. The chisel is really great for some tasks of that. Like if you have a round table leg and you want to make it square, you can do that, on the end. You can do that with a chisel. If you want to take a round hole and make a round hole into a square hole, a chisel will do that for you. But if you want to cut a board that's 8 feet long into 4 feet long with a chisel, you can do it, but it is extremely inefficient. And so it takes a lot of steps. It takes a lot of chops with a chisel to cut all the way through a board. So if you have if your language has one tool that it will be useful for one thing really well, and it'll be extremely inefficient for all the other things, which means the steps to explain how to do something are going to be extremely complex, because it takes a whole lot of little chisel blows to go from log to furniture. Whereas if you have a saw and an axe, these are different tools that have different things. One thing will get you rough, with an axe you can get from log to rough plank shape much more efficiently. With a saw you can get from planks to specific pieces that you need much more efficiently. If you have electricity, you can do a whole lot more. But, so that's the thing of saying, like, that these primitive languages, they were complex, but they weren't efficient. And as people, move together and you have like universalization of things and people are borrowing from each other, it seems very providential that the Bible came at the time, first when you had the Hebrews kind of inventing the alphabet, and then by the time of the New Testament, the Greeks had developed the alphabet with vowels in it. And there was a really interesting video that PVK shared about a Jewish rabbi in England talking about the difference of Hebrew, where you read from right to left, and Greek, where you read from left to right, and how it uses the different hemispheres of our brain differently. So that's kind of like getting into the McGilchrist thing. So even if you think about it, that like your life will be different if you live in a culture where you read from right to left versus left to right. It's going to affect things. It's going to have an impact. And I think that we have all this difference in culture because of this thing. And as I said, like the Babel story has this technological element to it. And when it makes me think of is, when you look at like these times in culture where like colonial people brought technology to the natives, and it kind of like they didn't handle it well or whatever, they didn't know what to do with it, like introducing alcohol to the Native Americans, and they didn't really have that as part of their normal functioning, and therefore they weren't able to handle it well because they couldn't incorporate it into their culture in a useful way. It's very destructive. Or like when Western agricultural techniques that maybe were good for developing, like empty grasslands, when those ideas get incorporated into countries where they have all this rainforest, everybody starts clear cutting the rainforest. And that's a lot less efficient. It's a waste of, it's not a good, it's technological, it's not the best use. But when we look at like how different cultures developed according to the places where they lived, and not just technologically, but like, the differences that have developed in time over culture. I think it's really amazing. And I think that this is getting to kind of the point of, this Tower of Babel thing happened because people were, not because technology is bad, but because technology is bad in the hands of people that want to use it for the wrong things. Um, and I think that was the problem, is that the people with their unity of communication and their ability to speak to one another so efficiently, they weren't using that technology for good things. And that's why God stopped it. But as those civilizations split up and all the, developed separately, they've, if we look over the long span of history, really the only progress that happens is from people developing things, usually in response to adversity, and then sharing that with others, with other cultures. And so that's why I think, like, when you look at the idea of like the exile, the time that the Israelites spend in Egypt, the time that they spent in the desert, like that was a time when God shaped them. That second generation coming out of the desert, like they were just fully relying on God. God had provided all of their meals. He provided their guidance. He kept their clothing and their shoes preserved miraculously. Like that was a confident group of people, I think, they really believed that their God could take care of them. And then even when you see like, the Israelites being sent off into exile in Babylon, and the Israelites that were taken in exile to Assyria spread into all these places. And then when you look at Pentecost, there was worshipers of Israelites from all over the world. Some were Persian, some were Greek, some were Roman, some were Ethiopian and Egyptian, and they'd gone into all these scattered lands, and they were all coming back to Jerusalem to celebrate at Pentecost. And then God gifts them with the Holy Spirit, and Peter speaks, and they all hear the words that Peter speaks in their native language, and they take that information in their native language back to their own countries and spread it in their native language. And the tradition of translation in the Hebrew scriptures is vast. It's always been there. Not only just the translation in Greek, but the translation into Aramaic that came through the exile into Babylon, and the Coptic church has their own, and Syriac, and all these different languages. Like the Hebrews have never had this kind of snobbery about the information in the Word of God. And so that's something that I think is really important to understand, is that from the very beginning, like this information was being translated. And I think that's something you can think about, like when you look at like the Islamic idea that the Quran can only be understood in Arabic. If you want to really understand the Quran, you have to learn Arabic. Because if it's not in Arabic, it's not actually the Quran. It's just like a commentary on the Quran. So, that's much more limited, because that means you have to learn a language. And when you learn a language, you learn a culture, and you learn a certain way of thinking. And I think that is the weakness of Islam, that if you need to learn a language and a culture in order to understand the words of this book, then you're trapped, because it means, which also shows the it is the weakness of it. If the arguments don't stand up when they're translated, then there's something missing there, something that's a little bit less than true, I would say. Whereas, I think if you look at God in his sovereignty, he's the master of language. Language is the way that he created the world. And so when he splits these languages up, he's not worried about the information being translated from one language to another. And I think that's actually part of his plan. Because if you look at it like the you know, the Christians that really latched on to like the Greek version of the Old Testament, and the New Testament was written in Greek, and they kind of had a certain way of you know, thinking about it and interpreting it, and then it's translated into Latin in the West, and then that translation, it doesn't, some would say that maybe like some things are wrong or whatever, but you know, if there wasn't a word that was exactly the right word, you know, you borrow a word from the original language or you add a word or something, the meaning gets changed. But it doesn't get changed to the point where it means like something else or the opposite, but instead it kind of like unlocks another degree of meaning. And I think that there's actually something really beautiful about the way that, not that I'm saying I agree with all of it, but like Eastern theology developed with their translation, and then like Western with the Latin developed another way, and the Ethiopic church developed in a sort of different way with their translation, and then the Hebrews who did not accept Christianity at the time of the early church kept on sharpening and developing their theology and their understanding of the Old Testament. And you know, there's so much that's been, you know, added to the Hebrew understanding of those scriptures as well. And we're now where when people are interacting with each other and learning from those traditions, like I believe that translation of the scripture into different languages was actually a good thing that brought about different things, because there is a strong tie between language and culture. And I believe that the differences in cultures are all reflections of the diversity that God created in humankind. Whereas if he had left them all in that Tower of Babel, City of Babel, they would have had a monoculture. They would have all not only spoken the same language, but they never would have developed the kind of diversity that they did. And they would have all stayed in one geographic location. And so then they wouldn't have, you know, geographic location influences so much about who a people are. And, you know, there's a difference between like the people that live in the mountains and the people that live on the plains, and the people that live in the sea, the people who live in the cold, the people who live in warm. Like those are all factors that shape a culture. And these different language elements are also a big part of that. And so that's why I think even like, then we get to the Reformation, the Bible is translated into more native languages, German and English and Dutch, and it again unlocks new things because people think differently because of their language, and then when they interact with the Word of God in that new language, they see something that maybe somebody else didn't see. And I don't think that it's something that wasn't there. There isn't supposed to be there. Now, for instance, when we look at the book Dominion, there's, you know, and it's interesting because it's one person looking who did not have particular religious loyalties, but he looks at the progressive kind of series of events that happen through the history of Christianity. And he starts from before then, kind of with the development of like monotheism in Persia, or with Zoroastrianism, and you know, the series of events. And these are all kind of like these psychotechnologies that come a lot of the times through either the Bible being translated into new languages, or coming into contact with people or groups of people who speak a different language, and therefore bring their unique cultural outlooks into the you know, the body of knowledge that's, you know, that contained in the church as a whole. And this you know, this is like the way that God, you know, is shaping the world that we live in, you know. And it's it's interesting, I think of that parable about the wheat and the tares. And on the one sense, I think that that parable is true for every group of people, from every country, every local church, probably every, city and town, and even the families. You know, People rise up, and who you can't tell who's the good and who's the bad necessarily, not by looking at them. Only God can really tell. But there's a but thinking about that in that sense, like, well, this gardening concept, and talking about the you look at that parable of the sower, there's these different soils that are good. Well, what does a gardener do who's trying to cultivate something? He doesn't just dump all the seeds in one place, he separates them. He separates this type from that. He puts the correct seed in the correct environment, gives it the proper care that it needs. And I think that in a way, when we look at history, like the providential way that God works through, things like global catastrophes and, changes in weather and climate and natural disasters, droughts and famines. Yeah, like we look at those things and we always want to see like, oh, it was so bad. But, yeah, sometimes those things affect people in bad ways, and it causes some people to suffer, and some people die, but other people survive and they grow and they thrive. And I think that we can kind of see this providential way that God moves people around and groups of people and who they come into contact with. And if you look at the set of circumstances that were happening in the world, or around the Mediterranean part of the world, at least, like at the time when Christ came, it was the perfect stage for the development and transmission of this gospel message to be effective. If it happened 100 years earlier, it would have just stayed in one spot or whatever. It's just very interesting the way this works. So the thing that to me is interesting is that I think, now we have like the churches growing faster in Asia and Africa than anywhere else, and I'm excited to see what happens as these people interact with the Bible in their own languages and learn about it and understand it and bring their own unique cultural contributions. And I do look in sadness upon like the way that like the Spanish colonized America, supposedly in the name of Christ, bringing the Catholic tradition, and really they did kind of impose a culture and a language on those people, and the cultural distinctives of the natives were lost. And I think, if they could have done that in a better way, then there could have been some unique things. And, and it's tough to say because God, God knows everything. He's in control, and I thought about like, what, we look at it, when we say that was a tragedy, it was wrong. It could have been worse though. I was thinking about this because those people, the Aztecs and the Mayans, like they were so prolific in their worship that involved so much human sacrifice, and it was really brutal. And I wonder if if they hadn't been affected by disease and things like that, there is a chance. Like, what if that culture gained the technology of metalworking and gunpowder from the Spanish, and then, was able to incorporate that into their worldview? Well, then they might have come and like conquered Europe and killed everybody else or whatever. It could have happened. I don't know. So, but then I look at it the same way, and like, it's interesting. Like in the Aztec culture, the people all believed, or for the most part, the true believers believed in the necessity of their human sacrifices, to the point where the people would see it as like a badge of honor, and they would willingly go up there themselves, and they would walk up these big ziggurats, and they would see this as like a heroic deed, like I am sacrificing myself for my people so that the rains will continue to fall and the food will grow and all this stuff that they had. And if you think about it, like, could you not have taken to those people a message and said, wait a minute, let me tell you about one man who was the perfect man, and his sacrifice was the final sacrifice, and therefore you do not need to do this anymore. They would have understood that message, maybe. But that wasn't the way that it was communicated. And it's even like, it's actually really interesting. There's like this picture in here where they show this this Aztec or god that they worshipped. This weird little guy here. And here's what it says. The bubbles on this statue represent lumpy fat deposits of flayed human skin. Zipe Totec, worshipped in Central America as the flayed one, appeared to the Christian conquerors of the Mexica not a god, but a demon. So the Spanish came in and saw, this is paganism. And but they could say, like, wow, you worship a god who was flayed and whipped and tortured. Like, we know a god like that. Let me tell you about him. They didn't do that. They weren't trying to make the cultural connection. I mean, this is part of their big sin. And part of it probably was because they didn't have a good understanding. More of their concepts of the way the world works came from Aristotle and from the Greek notions than it did from the Bible. But if they took the biblical account seriously, then they would say, these people on the other side of the globe who speak different languages, they all came from the same place. And they all are part of humanity. And, they should be recipients of the gospel. But it was a very messy thing, the way that the Catholic Church kind of blended itself with the Spanish crown, and the colonial process in North America was not very good. So, there's a bunch more stuff I could probably get to, and I will have to edit this a little bit and put more out later, but that's some of the things that I'm thinking about. And it's part of why I reject, for Christians, I reject the Hebrew only. Hebrew is the ultimate way to read the Bible. I agree, but I also staunchly defend the fact that you can understand the truth that God wants to speak to you in your own language. And maybe that's just very Protestant of me, but I believe it to be true. And I think evidence shows that that wasn't even an idea that came about in the, solely at the Reformation. The Reformation was more or less the time when printing presses meant that a lot more people could have their own Bibles, which is also, a really great thing. But I think this is a fascinating story. And I think that, the more closely we look at it, I think we can discover a lot of interesting things, and that there's a lot more of a global continuous story that we can make out of this as we study it. So I'm going to include a bunch of interesting videos about language and things that I've been pondering, and hopefully I'll get to developing some more succinct and direct thoughts about how this kind of applies to everything.